Good afternoon. Every week the house gets bigger. It's so good to see you all after so many, what's it been, 2 years, 5, 7? How long have we been at home? Good to see you all back. Thank you all for coming to the historic McFarland Hubbard House, headquarters of the West Virginia Humanities Council, for the third in our little lecture series of 2022. This year's series, supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities Initiative, A More Perfect Union, aims to explore issues of civic engagement and civics education as part of a series of programs leading up to the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. The lead up to and aftermath of Executive Order 9066 is one of the most remarkable stories in American history. You could call it public history, military history, social history, civics history. It's all of these and much, much more. And it's still not over. It's nothing ever is. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Shirley Ann Higuchi, Associate Executive Director of Legal and Regulatory Affairs for the American Psychological Association, also chair of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, and author of Setsuko's Secret, Heart Mountain and the Legacy of Japanese American Incarceration. I'm going to keep this introduction very brief because I'm personally very excited for today's talk. My own background is in literature, not history. About 150 years ago, when I was finishing up my dissertation on American autobiography and political protest, I read as widely as I could in the literature of the Nisei, which was the first U.S.-born generation of Japanese Americans, citizens by birth, where their parents' generation had been ineligible legally. Dr. Higuchi's parents were of that Nisei generation. As children, she and her brother only knew of Heart Mountain, Wyoming as the place where her parents met during World War II. There's a lot we don't know about our parents when we're coming up. But following a serious cancer diagnosis, Dr. Higuchi's mother, Setsuko, shared her vision for a museum at the site of the former camp, where she had been donating funds and volunteering in secret for many years. After her mother's death, Dr. Higuchi visited the site. That visit would not only change her life, it would introduce her to a part of her mother that she never knew. Today, Dr. Higuchi comes to discuss her book, Setsuko's Secret, Family and Communal History, the legacy of the unlawful imprisonment of over 100,000 American citizens, and a window into the camp life that was very rarely revealed to the children of the incarcerated. I understand we're going to begin with a short film. Please turn your attention to the screen, after which we will welcome to the lectern Dr. Shirley Ann Higuchi.
I always knew that my parents met as children at a place called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. And my mother, Setsuko, always called it a place of love. It was only after she died, however, that I learned the truth. Heart Mountain was a prison. 14,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated there during World War II for the crime of looking like the enemy. Setsuko's Secret is my attempt to understand the lives of my family, myself, in the complicated history of the Japanese American experience. Both sets of my grandparents immigrated from Japan. The Higuchis came first, arriving in 1915 from Saga, on the southern island of Kyushu. They started farming in Santa Clara County, California. My mother's parents, the Saitos, came in 1918 and in 1923. They lived in San Francisco's Japantown and opened a store. Life in California was hard for Japanese Americans. State law banned immigrants from owning land, and Caucasian neighbors often resented their success. The children of immigrants called the Nisei had to work extra hard to prove they were loyal Americans. Despite hardships, many Japanese Americans found the good life and made their way in society. Some became professionals and owned their own home, and others excelled in college. But then came December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, wartime hysteria and racism intensified towards Japanese immigrants and Japanese American citizens. They called them spies or saboteurs, despite the lack of evidence. Then on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to ban Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Census records told the government where to find Japanese Americans. Signs posted in neighborhoods said they had just days to pack and leave. They could only bring what they could carry. My family was issued a duffel bag with their name and number stenciled on the outside. Shikata ganai, some said, the Japanese term for it can't be helped. There was little resistance. They were first sent to assembly centers, which were temporary concentration camps on converted fairgrounds and racetracks. Some families slept in horse stalls and were forced to live like animals. This lasted a few months. Then the prisoners rode on a darkened train to one of the 10 concentration camps scattered across the U.S. My father remembers peering under the window shades to see where the train was going. My family was sent to Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. Many prisoners wept when they saw their new home surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Wind and dust swept through the tar paper walls. The barracks had no running water, the bathrooms had no privacy, and the mess hall food was terrible. Summers were sweltering and winters were brutal. The prisoners repeated another term, gaman, which means endure. In spite of this treatment, many incarcerees yearned to serve the country that imprisoned them. They enlisted in the army and fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific. But others stood up for their rights. More than 80 men at Heart Mountain resisted the military draft as long as they were prisoners. They were convicted and sent to federal prison. The rest of the Japanese American community shunned them for decades. My parents and grandparents spent 3 years behind barbed wire. After the war, they, along with many others in the community, wanted to put the shame and the rejection behind them. They never talked about it. My generation, called the Sansei, could not understand why. Only after my mother died did I realize the depth of her commitment to preserving the memory of the incarceration. She inspired me to understand this part of my family's history and my community's experience. Over the last decade, I've been committed to safeguarding against the racism and fear that drove the Japanese American incarceration. It was my mother, Setsuko, and her secret that taught me, and hopefully you, that we can never relax in the fight for justice. Well, thank you very much for coming out today. I appreciate everyone's interest in this very important topic, and I'm so happy that I'm able to share with you a more personal side to the Japanese American incarceration experience. And that's the secret that my mother kept about her incarceration, because she never really talked about what happened to her. So if we go back to the Higuchi history, which is my father's side, this photograph was taken around early 1930s, and they owned 14.25 acres in San Jose, California, now known as Silicon Valley today. They lost that land when they were forced into Heart Mountain, but it'll give you a sense of what their life was like. That's my father holding up an artificial gun in this photograph before the war, and the children behind him are actually Mexican immigrant children. And my grandfather used to let the Mexican family stay on my family's property because they had no place to live. So my father at that age was actually fluent in Spanish before he entered Heart Mountain. And he said when he left Heart Mountain, he didn't remember how to speak Spanish. He only spoke Japanese. The Saito family on the other side, my mother, her family, and this photograph actually has her in the middle here. He was a merchant in San Francisco. and they lived in Japantown, and he was very successful. They were Christian. My father's side was Buddhist, but he was very assimilated in the community. He was very popular because he was a merchant, and he had to really work with people in the community. So what happened when World War II broke out and the executive order was issued, the Japanese Americans, including my family, were forced into assembly centers. And one of them was Santa Anita Racetrack, which was converted into temporary housing. So they were forced into horse stalls, very uncomfortable environment, while Hart Mountain and other more permanent camps were being built. So these photographs are very interesting because they were taken by my father when he was about 11 or 12 years old. You would think that being in a prison camp, you wouldn't be able to have cameras, right? It would sort of be considered contraband. But my uncle Kiyoshi, who had left camp at that point and attended a safe haven university, University of Utah, actually brought him a camera. So he took this photograph of my grandfather sitting in his barrack in front of a potbelly stove, looking out, and a photograph of my grandfather and his younger sister, who was 5 at that time. She's now about 86 years old. But it really gave you a more honest sense of what it was like to be there, because these aren't filtered government photos. This is a government photo. This is a photograph of my parents in their class at Hart Mountain, and this was in 9th grade. And this was shortly before they were going to be released from camp. My father on the left, you could see he's a farm boy from San Jose. He wasn't that cute little kid before the war holding an artificial gun. And then my mother, who seems to be a very poised city girl. And I always kind of wondered, like, how was she able, and many other kids, able to really take care of themselves in camp? They really didn't have running water in the barracks or heat and electricity, so they really had to work pretty hard, I think, in terms of their maintenance of appearance. But my parents actually didn't really know each other in this photograph. They actually bumped into each other years later at the University of California, Berkeley, and remembered each other from the prison camp, and the rest is history after they fell in love. So this is some years later when my father accepted a position at the University of Michigan. This is like 1968-ish. We were really the all-American family in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There were no Asians to speak of. There were basically no Japanese Americans for sure. And all my friends were black and white. I had no Asian friends. So if you were to substitute these faces with Caucasian faces, they would be the perfect all-American family with the little sailor suit and the outfits that we're all wearing. And that's, of course, me in the middle in that little jumpsuit. So I think one of the byproducts of incarceration and something traumatic, and I'm sure you've heard about this from other folks, is many of the Nisei turned into workaholics. People don't use the term workaholism anymore. I don't know why, but it was a big thing, I think, when I was growing up. And my dad was always working at the university. I mean, constantly. He literally went to the lab or the university where he did research 7 days a week. And I just thought that's what most people did. And meanwhile, while he was busy working, I was a cheerleader at Ann Arbor here in high school, and I assimilated. There was no such thing to me of being Asian. I thought I was either white or black or somewhere in between, but you could see me in this cheerleading photo, and all the cheerleaders are black and white except for me on the far left. And what's really interesting about this is the girl who I'm standing or sitting on top of, Laura Gallagher, I just heard from her, and she's going to head out to our Hart Mountain Museum. I haven't seen her since high school, and I'm going to see her in July, so that'll be a nice reunion too. So when people think about the incarceration experience, and I even know for myself it was hard to really wrap my hands around and really understand it. You kind of really don't understand what drives you as a person. I feel like in some ways I could be somewhat compulsive, I could be a little controlling, I could be anxious, and you sort of think, well, aren't these typical things that most people, feel? But when I met Dr. Satsuki Ina, who was incarcerated at Tule Lake, she said a lot of the experiences that I had growing up and the way that my mother was, Setsuko, was a direct result of her incarceration experience. And if you read the book, it goes into a lot more detail, but she was obsessed with real estate. She had to constantly be buying and flipping homes. She wanted us to constantly move. And I'm like, stop, towards the end of her death, I said, I don't want to move anymore. And I didn't really realize her idea about owning property and having her own home and having many homes really, I think, stemmed from her incarceration experience. It was a really big deal for her to have a home. So this was very post-war, but before my mother, who's wearing the suit in the middle with the sunglasses. This is before she met my dad at University of California, Berkeley. When she graduated from high school, and this one really, there's always these family stories where you're like, what happened? Like, why did that happen? My grandfather arranged a marriage for my mother for a guy that lived in Japan. But she's not from Japan. She's from the United States. She was born in California. But I think it's those old immigrant customs that come up where somehow the father thinks it's okay to have your American daughter take a ship to Japan and meet a guy she's never met who happens to be Japanese. And you can imagine that was a war-torn country. Why would anyone want to go to Japan after the war and marry some guy they don't know? Well, she did go because her father asked her to go or told her to go. And then when she went there, she abruptly said, I'm not interested, and turned around, came back, went to college at the University of California, Berkeley, ran into my father, and again, the rest was history. So this is my mother at the University of California, Berkeley, with her younger sister, Kathy. And Kathy was born at Heart Mountain. She was actually born there. And so there's a pretty major age gap between the two. Interestingly, my Aunt Kathy, who's now 78, she didn't really know anything about Heart Mountain either, even though she was born there. And her daughter didn't know anything about Heart Mountain. So her daughter actually made a film about Kathy's life and said, I didn't understand why her birth certificate said she was born at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. I always thought she was born in San Francisco. So one of the issues that I know that folks wanted to hear about were legal issues during World War II. And the most famous cases are the Korematsu case, Hirabayashi, Yasu, and Endo. We'll talk a little bit about Fred Korematsu, who basically challenged his incarceration experience, and he was arrested. But his situation was very problematic because the court at the time said that the government had a right to incarcerate American citizens without due process due to military necessity. The court ruled 6-3 that it was a military necessity, but this justice, Frank Murphy, had said, this is racism. He said that in his dissent, and it's the worst decision that this court had ever made. So there were people on the Supreme Court that understood that it wasn't something that was legal and constitutional. What's really interesting, though, is this particular individual, Mitsui Endo, had challenged her incarceration as well. And she actually won her case 9-0 under the theory or the narrow approach that if you determine that you are not guilty or you're not a threat, that you could be released. And so she was determined to be loyal, so the Supreme Court ruled in favor of her on that narrow issue. This is a photograph where President Truman is greeting the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This was basically an all Japanese American combat team, many of them from Hawaii, but also those from Heart Mountain. When they turned 18, they either volunteered to fight or they were drafted. And so this is an interesting photograph because I always realized looking back at Truman, even though I didn't do a tremendous amount of research, he really had a lot of sympathy for the Japanese Americans. And I think he knew what was happening to them was wrong. In 1946, he tried to support a compensation bill for all the Japanese Americans that lost their land and property, like my family. And then in 1948, he was successful in passing a reparation or restitution bill, which was very limited and didn't have a lot of money attached to it. And when we researched the book, we found many stories, including Estelle Ishigo, who was a white woman who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain. The reason why she was there because she was married to a Japanese American, Arthur Ishigo, and she didn't want to be separated from her husband. So she was at camp. She suffered quite a bit. She had a hard time leaving the camp. And you hear stories about people who are in prison. They sometimes can't leave, especially if they had no place to go. And her and her husband had absolutely no place to go. And so what she ended up doing is writing the government asking for reimbursement under the 1948 Act. And Warren Burger, who later became chief of the Supreme Court, he basically said, you're not entitled to any reparation because you're white and you had a choice not to be there. But she was married to her Japanese American husband and she didn't want to be separated. There's a very sad story behind Estelle that I wrote about in my book, that she essentially was found in a basement many, many, many years later. Her husband had died early. He didn't do well with his incarceration experience. Her legs had been amputated. She had no food. And it was actually the Japanese American incarcerees in LA that discovered her in that basement and rescued her and put her into a nursing home. And despite her race, the Japanese Americans always considered her part of the Heart Mountain family. So the one thing that happened historically is that after the African American community experienced the civil rights movement, young Japanese Americans in my generation began to pick up the baton and advocated to tell the Japanese American story and wanted to learn what happened to their parents. Now, as I mentioned, my parents, the Nisei, they were very quiet about their incarceration. They never talked about it. So it was really their children and myself and others that really spoke out on the need for education and redress. I was actually in law school during a lot of this time period and still very, very young. But the man in the middle is Secretary Norman Mineta, who was also incarcerated at Heart Mountain with my parents as a child. And he ended up becoming Secretary of Commerce under Bill Clinton and Secretary of Transportation under George W. Bush, two separate administrations. And to his left is Senator Inouye, and to his right was Senator Matsunaga from Hawaii. But they really were active in creating a commission to first study the incarceration, and then after that, hearings were conducted. And here's a 1981 photograph of the Commission on Wartime Relocation. A lot of former Japanese Americans that were incarcerated came and testified. And this was really a break in terms of the psychological block where many incarcerees couldn't talk about it. You know, even though they had done nothing wrong, sometimes when you're accused of a crime and you're put into a prison camp, you believe you did something wrong and you feel ashamed that people accused you of doing something wrong. But allowing these incarcerees to come to Capitol Hill and tell their stories was really a healing process. And from that commission, a 1983 report came out, Personal Justice Denied, that revealed clearly that there was no security reason for the incarceration. So after the release of this commission report, they proposed a bill saying, could there be an apology from the government and can there be some form of redress? It would take until 1988 for that bill to be passed by President Reagan here in this photograph. And with this issued formal apology for the incarceration, each surviving incarceree was paid $20,000. You had to be alive, so many, many incarcerees at that point were dead. It didn't pass on to their children or anything of that nature. So my grandparents never received the apology or the reparation, but both of my parents did. So many people ask about Korematsu, given the activity politically that we've had, both in the Supreme Court and in the White House and in our communities in the last several years. So during the travel ban case that was occurring in 2018, one of the dissents that were in place said this feels a lot like the Korematsu case. Like you're able to say, like, just because there is a military necessity or there is a potential risk, without any evidence, you can have a travel ban. So what was interested is that Justice Roberts, who I actually know personally because of my work in DC, had really said that we have no place in our Constitution, in our laws, and in this court to support Korematsu. And he said Korematsu was very, very wrong. But it's not that he actually overturned Korematsu. So unfortunately for Fred Korematsu and his family, Korematsu still stands on the book. So if anything else were to happen to another group of people, they too could be probably put in prison camps without due process. Another incredible story that I want to share with you is Light One Candle. And this is a story of Clarence Matsumura, who's right here. And he was incarcerated at Heart Mountain. He had a very kind of moving story where he was actually born in Wyoming. He was from Wyoming, which is unusual for Japanese Americans. But they moved over to California in LA because they wanted better schools for their kids. So when they happened to be in California, that's when the war broke out. So they got forced into Heart Mountain, where they were from anyways. But if they would have never went to California, where the exclusion area is, they would have never been put in camps, because Wyoming, they didn't incarcerate Japanese Americans. So there were all these weird stories that I found out about, where just because you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could have been incarcerated for 3 or 4 years without due process. But if you happen to be in Wyoming or Michigan or Ohio or probably even West Virginia, you would have been okay. But the beautiful story about Clarence Matsumura, who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain, is he actually volunteered and fought in the war after he turned 18 and after he left Heart Mountain. He joined the Japanese American unit, the 442, and he was part of the 522 battalion. So he was one of the individuals that actually helped liberate Jewish prisoners on a death march from a work camp to Dachau. And these Jewish survivors were stunned to see Japanese faces in a U.S. military uniform. It's an actual photograph from the death march. It was this march that Clarence Matsumura was able to rescue Sally Ganor. Essentially, when Clarence Matsumura, on the left, was in the 552 battalion, he said that when he discovered the prisoners, almost all of them were wearing black and white striped uniforms. I don't know how many of them there were, but they couldn't stand on their feet. There was nothing but skin and bones. They couldn't speak. I found them lying on the ground, many of them unconscious. These people were starving. So what we said is we need to get them someplace warm and get them some food. And then Sally Ganor, the Lithuanian Holocaust survivor, wrote in his memoirs, "I stared at them, unable to grasp the situation. Japanese?" One of the men came up and knelt to me. He gently touched me on the shoulder and said, "You are free, my boy. You're free now," he said, and then smiled. That smile has been with me ever since. Sally and Clarence would meet again 47 years later in Jerusalem at a ceremony commemorating the liberation of Dachau. And when they met, they described that reunion, and they said, "We stared at each other and we smiled. I knew that was Clarence immediately." The last part of my talk is about the Mineta-Simpson Institute. I talked about Secretary Norman Mineta, who was incarcerated at Heart Mountain as a boy, and then his dear friend, Senator Alan K. Simpson, who many of you may remember. Well, interestingly enough, Senator Simpson was a 10-year-old boy too in Cody, Wyoming, when Mineta was incarcerated at Heart Mountain with my parents. Well, the Boy Scout troop that Simpson was in, the Cub Master allowed the boys to go into the camp to play with the Japanese American boys. So actually, Norm and Al met behind barbed wire at Heart Mountain and ended up being lifelong friends, serving in Congress until up to this day, except unfortunately Secretary Mineta passed away a couple of weeks ago. They've been coming to Heart Mountain and celebrating our pilgrimages every year. And this photograph was taken in 2011 when we unveiled our world-class museum. That is Tom Brokaw, who did the intro and forward to my book, along with Norm and my good friend Al. I just heard that Senator Simpson will be giving the eulogy for Secretary Mineta in Washington, D.C. at June 11th. So that'll be a very heartbreaking experience since they're so used to being together each year. Well, I appreciate that comment. I mean, that's part of the reason why we're now building the Mineta Simpson Institute, which is going to be a think tank at the very place in which my family and over 10,000 individuals were incarcerated at. We are going to do education for public officials. We're going to work across the aisle. We're going to try to put this curriculum and educate in many, many schools. And the one thing that my father said, and he's still alive at age 91, and he made it. I mean, he was chair of the pharmaceutics department at University of Utah. I think there were a lot of scars that occurred to us growing up because of his incarceration experience. But he didn't, because he didn't talk about it. What he said to me, he said, Shirley, I feel that my job now at age 91 is to help you help me tell this story. And the more people you can educate about what had happened, that could be a learning tool for present day issues that are occurring now, whether issues around immigration, children being placed in camps on the border, the issue that you had mentioned. I think it's education, education, education. I wasn't told this story when I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in my high school of 2,000 students. I wasn't told about this story at the University of Michigan where I went undergrad. I had to search to find the information to write a paper in a philosophy class. It wasn't even an Asian American studies class. When I was in law school at Georgetown, there was no class specifically about the incarceration, which you think is kind of crazy considering it's one of the worst constitutional issues that were ever addressed or denied by the Supreme Court, as it's been written today, even by our current Chief Judge Roberts, that it was a bad decision. So I think it's education, education, education. And I also think that for Japanese Americans, especially my parents, the Nisei, who were the quiet Americans, they never talked about it. They never talked. So basically that in itself is a fracturing of the community, right? If you end up after being incarcerated in Wyoming, you're scattered throughout the United States because you have no home to go to. And the only relatives I have are in California, and we're talking this is 1968. How am I supposed to learn about this? And so I think that I don't want other children to experience what I've experienced, which is not knowing about your own family history. I think we all need to know about our family history. Thank you. Uncle Kiyoshi, at the time of his incarceration, my father was only like 10 years old. He was actually attending San Jose State University, studying chemistry. And when the war broke out, it was all Japanese Americans that had to evacuate. They didn't care if you were teaching or if you were in school. There were no exemptions. If you were Japanese, I think it was 1/8 blood, you had to go. And so he unfortunately got yanked from the San Jose State University, was put into Heart Mountain. But slowly, because of the help of the Amish and the Quaker and other folks, they were encouraging young college-age students to leave Heart Mountain and go to the Midwest in particular to finish their education. And where my uncle went was the University of Utah, which was his safe haven university. He actually graduated there successfully. It was very hard on him because he had no money. I don't even know how he did it. And then after that, he met his brother, who was actually teaching at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And he did his PhD under the mentorship of my older uncle, who was never incarcerated because he was in Wisconsin, where they didn't incarcerate. So the whole thing didn't make sense. A really sad story, which I didn't mention, it wasn't in this PowerPoint, was when my grandparents and my father and his younger sister were incarcerated at Heart Mountain. The oldest brother, James, was actually a medical doctor in the Army at the time. So he was actually serving in the military at the time, and they took away his parents, they took away his younger brother, my dad, and his little sister, who was only 5 years old. They put them all in Heart Mountain, and they transferred him to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, which I think was another way to sort of, separate again. You can't stay in the military base in California. You need to go to Arkansas. So what happened there was, because of the alien land laws, my grandfather, as an immigrant, couldn't own land in California. So the 14.25 acres in San Jose was actually in the name of James. And the saddest photo that I have, it's not in this PowerPoint, it's in the book though, was that in his Army uniform, he had to leave the base to get a leave. He had to go down to the notary public, and he signed away the 14.25 acres. And he said in his memoirs, that was the hardest thing that his family had ever done, was giving up that land. And when I talked to my aunt, who was 5 years old at the time, she said up to her parents' death, my grandfather and grandma, they argued over and over about the decision to get rid of the farm in a distress sale, as opposed to just keeping it and just, letting the dice fall where they may. So anyways, that's a long-winded answer to, there were universities that accepted Japanese Americans that were behind barbed wire, and it was the good work of the Quakers and Amish and others that made that happen. Well, I think that after the first year or two, they had procedures where they would interview, I think, the camp inmates. And I'm assuming Uncle Kiyoshi was interviewed in filling out the paperwork in terms of attending the University of Utah. But also other family members were able to leave also during an interview process. And my father, who at that point was probably only, whatever the ninth grade is, 11, 12, he was about 14 or so, he was in the process of leaving Hart Mountain and filling out the paperwork and being interviewed by a staff person to go live with his, his older brother, the one that was at the Wisconsin location. And he was all set to go. I actually read his war relocation files, and it's amazing what was in there. The kind of stuff that they were saying about him to sort of justify him leaving didn't even really make any sense. I mean, that's how, back then you could do anything. We talk about how we never wore seatbelts and everyone smoked cigarettes and nobody locked their doors. Well, that was how the camp sort of was. There really wasn't a lot of oversight and procedure, which makes you think, is this really a prison camp or not? But the counselor had made a comment like, my father was an unusually good-looking boy. Like, that's a criteria to let somebody out of a prison? I mean, like, really? So I just thought that was really odd. But they actually let many prisoners out as long as they didn't go back to California. There were a lot of political issues that were at stake here. I mean, the racism against Asians in California existed way before World War II. As a matter of fact, one of the photographs that I have that says, Japs keep on moving, I think it was in the film, that was actually taken in the early 1930s. So that had nothing to do with the incarceration of the camp. The West Coast individuals were really, really against Asian migration at that point. And so, why didn't they incarcerate the Japanese Americans in Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor was bombed? Well, because from a political and economical standpoint, that would shut down the island, right? But there was so much jealousy on the farming that the Japanese Americans were doing on the West Coast, including my family, that there was a lot of political support that made it ripe for the incarceration. It was very, very lockstep after they made that decision, and Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Well, it's really funny, being kind of a Japanese American dummy growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and not knowing anything about the incarceration. I really didn't have a full appreciation for the pilgrimages until maybe, honestly, I would say maybe 8 years ago. And because when you don't really understand the nature of your own family's incarceration, you're kind of ignorant in terms of knowing how to grieve or to accept or to process that information. But the one thing about the pilgrimages is every year at the end of July, and we're having one this year, and we're actually having a groundbreaking for the Minetta Simpson Institute, all former incarcerees that are still around, They come back to that site with their children and grandchildren and friends, and we essentially use it as a way to educate, to connect with the community, because you can imagine how difficult it is to build this museum in Cody, Wyoming. You know, it's very, very difficult. So we have to do a lot of work with the community in order to get them to understand what we're all about and how we need to collaborate together. But it's a time to grieve, it's a time to educate, it's a time to honor those that were incarcerated there. It's a time for us to honor Secretary Mineta, which we'll do this summer. But it's a time to really come together and reflect. And what's beautiful about Heart Mountain, and I encourage all of you to come and visit because it's right near Yellowstone National Park, is that the land is really sacred ground. The land in that mountain once was the home of the Crow Indians who lived there, and that land was taken away from them by the government. And then in 1942 or 41, they take all the Japanese Americans from the West Coast and they imprison them at Heart Mountain. And after that, I still visit some of the Crow Nation. They have no land there anymore. It's really very, very sad. And there was no remnants from Heart Mountain. There were a few buildings, there was a plaque or whatever that Heart Mountain was here. So it was really the coming together of both the Japanese American community and the Wyoming community that created this museum and this memorial site. And the pilgrimages every year are a constant reminder of what happened in 1942. And that's why we meet and celebrate each other every year. Yes?
Do the other prison camps do the same thing? The other concentration
Right.
camps,
There were
are they doing the same thing you all are doing?
They're trying, and they are succeeding, and I think they'll continue to succeed. One of the more famous camps in California that was actually northern rural areas, Manzanar. But that camp and that museum is actually run by the federal government. It's an MPS site. It's like the Smithsonian museums when you go to Washington, D.C. It's the same kind of setup. We didn't want to do that at our museum because we wanted the ability to tell the story from the incarceree perspective. We wanted to be able to talk about things that were uncomfortable that the government may not allow us to do in a government, museum. So that was a conscious decision. There's a Topaz Museum in Utah right near Salt Lake City. It's really about an hour outside of Salt Lake in a very, again, desolate, dry area. And I know the other sites like Tule Lake, that's in a very rural area in California, as well as in Arizona and other locations like Colorado. They're trying to at least get National Park Service status or trying to get memorials in place. And I think they too want to see a museum built one day. And I'm trying to help all the camps involved. And we're currently working on legislation in Capitol Hill, which would create a funding mechanism for groups like ours to get educational funds, probably groups like yours too. It's, supporting education. So hopefully that bill will pass. I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't go into much detail on that. Heart Mountain is actually known for a resistance. They're called the resistors, the Heart Mountain resistors. It was like 70 or 80 or so men that basically said, we are not going to fight unless you restore our rights. And one of those resistors is Takashi Hoshizaki, who is now 98 years old and is currently sitting on my board still. He's still alive. So it's a very complicated situation, but when he was in Heart Mountain, he made a very conscious decision to resist. And that had big consequences. He was arrested. There was a mass trial in Wyoming, one of the largest mass trials ever. It was a racist judge. The judge threw the book at them, all of them, and they were put in a federal penitentiary. And they had spent, a couple of years there, eventually released, eventually pardoned. Everything was, kind of dismissed. But when I talked to him, he said that it was like going from one prison to another. So in some ways, he really didn't feel like he had much to lose by asserting his rights. And when I did the research and I looked at his National Archives, it was right there in perfect handwriting. I will fight if you restore my rights. Takashi later served in the Korean War. So it wasn't a matter of being a coward. It wasn't a matter of being dishonest and saying or dodging the draft. He really wanted to get his full rights restored before he picked up a gun and fought on behalf of the country that imprisoned him and his family. Question back there? Even back during that time period, education was very important to the Japanese American parents and the families. So when they were yanked from their schools and they were put into these camps, many of the teachers weren't as qualified as the ones they had before. And a lot of the prisoners who were former teachers actually ended up teaching, which helped the educational process. But they did have schools in the camps. They had to because there were so many children there. And I know that I don't know how many of you are familiar with George Takei, Sulu in Star Trek. He was actually incarcerated at Tule Lake, but before he was sent to Tule, he was actually at Santa Anita racetrack with my Aunt Emily, who I just showed you a photograph of, and they had a makeshift school even in the racetrack area underneath the bleachers. So somebody was at least trying to continue the educational process. But eventually, by the time the war was winding down, their schools were operating. They had teachers that seemed qualified, not all of them. And I was able to get into my family and my parents' report cards and actually see how my parents had done academically in the camp. And the sad part that I actually read about was that my mother had her appendix removed at the camp. And she had to walk from her barrack, which was a mile away, to this makeshift hospital. And that's where she had her appendix removed at age 11. And she couldn't see her family. I think she was in there for like close to 3 weeks. You know, if you could imagine, you're already in a camp, you're separated from your family, you have to have your appendix out in a makeshift hospital. So it was, the conditions weren't always really, really good. But she ended up getting a D in physical education. And I looked at that, I was like, but didn't they know she was getting her appendix out? You know, nowadays you would get some note written by your parent or something, but she actually got a D in physical education. And you might say, well, whatever, it was physical education, but when you come from a family where grades are really important, you see that you get a D over something that wasn't any fault of your own. I think it really affected her and really crushed her. The other thing I learned looking through the school records of all the students is they actually did categorization of, they were doing like psychological evaluations of the students. And I kind of got the sense what they were trying to do was they were trying to figure out which kids, which 11-year-old kids here are the best to be Americanized, the best to really bring along. And my mother's name was Setsuko, and in the staff person's handwriting when my mother was being interviewed, the name Shirley was written in the corner. So they had sort of given her this American name, Shirley, while she was in camp. Unfortunately, she named me Shirley, and she didn't keep the name, and she took the cool name Setsuko, which now sounds a lot more hipper than Shirley. I mean, who names a Japanese-American kid Shirley? I don't know. I guess if you're from Michigan, it's probably more acceptable name. I don't know any Shirleys, actually, anymore. But so it's just interesting what they did to the children while in camp. They actually put them in C groups, B groups, A groups. And when I talked to Judge Raymond Uno, who's still alive, he's 91 years old, the first minority judge in Utah, he still talks today at age 91 about how he was labeled as a B student. And it really crushed him. He believed he was dumb, that he should have been in the A category. And I still hear these 91-year-old incarcerates talk about, like, yeah, I was in the B and the C class. Shirley's mom was in the A, So it really affects children when they're labeled like that. They remember this. They remember these things until their old age. So. Many of the Japanese Americans wanted to go back to California, but like my family, my father's family, my mother's, they had no home to go to. So many of the Japanese Americans, in an effort to assimilate and find jobs, landed in places like Cincinnati. There's a big Japanese American population there, Cleveland, as well as New Jersey, Seabrook community. So they became scattered throughout the Midwest mostly. And the Midwest, one would have thought during that time period, probably wasn't as susceptible to racism. But back in California, it was pretty dangerous to go back. And my parents both eventually got back to California, not easily. My grandfather suffered many heart attacks. He suffered a heart attack going into camp, and then he suffered a heart attack when he was forced to leave camp. And that was why the story I told you about my dad, where he couldn't be released, it was because he had to stay back to help his mother take care of his sister, because his father had another heart attack. So my dad never made it out. He was at Heart Mountain until the bitter end. But no, things were pretty bad. My Aunt Thelma, who's 100, the one that's living in Frederick, Maryland, when they went back to California, they were actually, there was a lot of problems, burning and guns shooting off and things like that. So it wasn't a very good time. Actually, I heard from some people that actually leaving the camp and trying to get back on your feet was worse than being put in the camp in the first place, because you have no place to go. Yeah, I've heard of, I haven't done a lot of research on the Greenbrier incarceration, but I've been tipped off by a couple of people that they had prisoners of war that were, well, what a nice place to stay besides Heart Mountain. I said, I'll go to Greenbrier. But I heard that they had used that as a prison holding tank, and that they were actually prisoners of war. Ray, do you know more about that? Oh, okay, you can.
It was held for like diplomats and high-level people. That's high-level accommodations. The diplomats couldn't be touched. They couldn't be put in a camp.
Right.
They had to be repatriated, so where do you hold them?
Right.
And so Hungarians, Italians, Japanese, and Germans all had to coexist.
That's really interesting. We have to do more research on that.
We have a book by a woman about that.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, we have a book at the house by a Caucasian woman who was married to a Japanese diplomat. And they went back to Japan or these other countries on a ship called the Gripsholm, which was owned by a Swedish shipping line, contracted out by the US government. And so they took Japanese diplomats back to Japan. They took Americans who were held in Japan and brought them back to the United States.
So was the Greenbrier actually a hotel operating at that time, and then they shut it down to accommodate these prisoners? That's very interesting. That must have been a lot better than Heart Mountain, I would think. They probably had running water, right, and heat, and not a potbelly stove in their barrack, but yeah. Interesting history. You hear all these stories that really embrace the entire country in different ways during that time period. And there are many stories that still haven't been told or talked about. So I'm going to continue onward in my journey and talk to as many people as I can about this. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Kyle. And thanks for having me.